So, and I think we will get a theory of that we will get a theory of portals, and then we can ask how the psychedelics are acting. Are they actually creating new portals or not? If they're not, we should nevertheless then understand how we could create a new portal, right? Maybe we have to just study what happens when we have kids. We know that technology creates new portals. So we have to reverse engineer that and then say, okay, could we somehow create new portals de novo with that,
with something like brain-computer interfaces, for example.
Yeah, or maybe just a chemical or something. So probably more complicated than a chemical. That's why I think that the psychedelics may, because they might be affecting this portal in certain ways that it turns it around and opens up. In other words, it maybe once we understand what this thing is a portal, your body is a portal,
yeah, it ain't a
understand
portal
all those
flying
complexities,
at you.
maybe we'll realize that portal can be shifted and to different parts of the deeper consciousness and give new windows on it. And so in that way, maybe, yes, psychedelics could open up new portals in the sense that they're taking something that's already a complex portal and just tweaking it a bit.
Well, but creating is a very powerful difference between morphing.
Right. Tweaking versus creating. I agree.
But maybe it gives you intuition to at least the full space of the kinds of things that this particular system is capable of. I mean, the idea, your idea that consciousness creates brains. I mean, that breaks my brain because I guess I'm still a physicalist in that sense, because that it's just much easier to intuit the world. It's practical to think, all right, there's a neural network, and what are the different ways fascinating capabilities can emerge from this neural network.
I agree. It's easier.
And so you start to, and then present to yourself the problem of, okay, well, how does consciousness arise? How does intelligence arise? How does emotion arise? How does memory arise? And how do we filter within this system all the incoming sensory information? We're able to allocate attention in different interesting ways. How do all those mechanisms arise? To say that there's other fundamental things we don't understand outside of space-time that are actually core to how this whole thing works is a bit paralyzing, because it's like, oh, we're not 10% done. We're like 0.001% done.
Well,
is the immediate feeling.
I certainly understand that. My attitude about it is, if you look at the young physicists who are searching for these structures beyond space-time, like amplitude and so forth, they're having a ball. Space-time, that's what the old folks did. That's what the older generation did. We're doing something that really is fun and new, and they're having a blast, and they're finding all these new structures. So I think that we're going to succeed in getting a new, deeper theory. I can just say what I'm hoping with the theory that I'm working on. I'm hoping to show that I could have this timeless dynamics of consciousness, no entropic time. I take a projection, and I show how this timeless dynamics looks like the Big Bang and the entire evolution of space-time. In other words, I see how my whole space-time interface.
So not just the projection doesn't just look like space-time. You can explain
the whole
from the origin of the universe.
That's what we have to do, and that's what the physicists understand. When they go beyond space-time to the amplitude and the cosmological polytope, they ultimately know that they have to get back the Big Bang story and the whole evolution, that whole story where there were no living things. There was just a point. And then the explosion, and then just particles at high energy, and then eventually the cooling down, and the differentiation, and finally matter condenses, and then life, and then consciousness. That whole story has to come out of something that's deeper and without time. And that's what we're up to. We want to get this. So the whole story that we've been telling ourselves about Big Bang and how brains evolved into consciousness will come out of a much deeper theory. And for someone like me, it's a lot. I mean, but for the younger generation, this is like, oh wow, all the low cherries aren't picked. This is really good stuff. This is really new fundamental stuff that we could do. So I can't wait to read the papers of the younger generation, and I want to see them.
Kids these days with their non-space-time
That's right.
assumptions. It's just interesting looking at the philosophical tradition of those difficult ideas you struggle with. If you look like somebody like Immanuel Kant, what are some interesting agreements and disagreements you have with a guy about the nature of reality?
So there's a lot in agreement, right? So Kant was an idealist, transcendental idealist, and he basically had the idea that we don't see nature as it is. We impose a structure on nature. And so in some sense, I'm saying something similar. I'm saying that, by the way, I don't call myself an idealist. I call myself a conscious realist, because idealism has a long history. A lot of different ideas come under idealism, and there's a lot of debates and so forth. It tends to be identified with, in many cases, anti-science and anti-realism. And I don't want either connection with my ideas, and so I just called mine conscious realism with an emphasis on realism, and not anti-realism. But the one place where I would, of course, disagree with Kant was that he thought that Euclidean space-time was a priori, right? We just know that that's false. So he went too far on that. But in general, the idea that we don't start with space-time, that space and time is in some sense forms of our perceptions. Yes, absolutely. And I would say that there's a lot in common with Berkeley in that regard. There's a lot of ingenious arguments in Berkeley. Leibniz in his monadology understood very clearly that the hard problem was not solvable. He posed a hard problem and basically dismissed it. Just said, you can't do this. And so if he came here, and saw where we are, he said, look, guys, I told you this 300 years ago. And he had his monadology. He was trying to do something like this. It's different from what I'm doing, but he had these things that were not in space and time, these monads. He was trying to build something. I'm trying to build a theory of conscious agents. My guess is that if he came here, I could just, if he saw what I was doing, he would understand it and immediately take off with it and go places that I couldn't. He would
So
have
there
no
would be
problems.
there would be overlap of the spirit of the ideas.
Absolutely.
Would be totally overlapping.
But his genius would then just run with it far faster than I could.
I love the humility here. So let me ask you about sort of practical implications of your ideas to our world, our complicated world. When you look at the big questions of humanity, of hate, war, what else is there? Evil, maybe there's the positive aspects of that, of meaning, of love. What is the fact that reality is an illusion? Perceived, what is the conscious realism when applied to daily life? What kind of impact does it have?
A lot, and it's sort of scary. We all know that life is ephemeral, and spiritual traditions have said, wake up to the fact that anything that you do here is going to disappear. But it's even more ephemeral than perhaps we've thought. I see this bottle because I create it right now. As soon as I look away, that data structure has been garbage collected. That bottle, I have to recreate it every time I look. So I spend all my money and I buy this fancy car. That car, I have to keep recreating it every time I look at it. It's that ephemeral. So all the things that we invest ourselves in, we fight over, we kill each other over, we have wars over. These are all, it's just like people in a virtual reality simulation. Right. And there's this Porsche. We all see the Porsche. Well, that Porsche exists when I look at it. I turn my headset and I look at it. And then if Joe turns his headset the right way, he'll see his Porsche. It's not even the same Porsche that I see. He's creating his own Porsche. So these things are exceedingly ephemeral. And now, just imagine saying that that's my Porsche. Well, you can agree to say that it's your Porsche, but really, the Porsche only exists as long as you look. So this all of a sudden, what the spiritual traditions have been saying for a long, long time, this gets cashed out in mathematically precise science. It's saying ephemeral, yes, in fact, it lasts for a few milliseconds, a few hundred milliseconds while you look at it, and then it's gone. So the whole idea, why are we fighting? Why do we hate? It's, we fight over possessions because we think that we're small little objects inside this pre-existing space-time. We assume that mansion and that car exists independent of us, and that somehow these little things, can have our sense of self and importance enhanced by having that special car or that special house or that special person. When in fact is just the opposite. You create that mansion every time you look. You're something far deeper than that mansion. You're the entity which can create that mansion on the fly. And there's nothing to the mansion except what you create in this moment. So all of a sudden, when you take this point of view, it has all sorts of implications for how we interact with each other, how we treat each other. And again, a lot of things that spiritual traditions have said, it's a mixed bag. Spiritual traditions are a mixed bag, so let me just be right up front about that. I'm not promoting any particular, but they do have some insights.
Yeah, they have wisdom.
They have certain wisdom. I can point to nonsense, I won't go into it, but I can also point to lots of nonsense. So the issue is to look for the key insights. And I think they have a lot of insights about the ephemeral nature of objects in space and time and not being attached to them, including our own bodies, and reversing that I'm not this little thing, a little consciousness trapped in the body. And the consciousness itself is only a product of the body. So when the body dies, the consciousness disappears. It turns completely around. The consciousness is fundamental. The body, my hand exists right now because I'm looking at it. My hand is gone. I have no hand. I have no brain. I have no heart. If you looked, you'll see a heart. Whatever I am is this really complicated thing in consciousness. That's what I am. All the stuff that I thought I was is something that I create on the fly and delete. So this is completely a radical restructuring of how we think about possessions, about identity, about survival of death, and so forth. This is completely transformative. But the nice thing is that this whole approach of conscious agents, unlike the spiritual traditions, which have said, in some cases, similar things, they've said it imprecisely. This is mathematics. We can actually now begin to state precisely, here's the mathematical model of consciousness, conscious agents, here's how it maps onto space-time, which I should sketch really briefly. And here's why things are ephemeral, and here's why you shouldn't be worried about the ephemeral nature of things, because you're not a little tiny entity inside space and time. Quite the opposite. You're the author of space and time.
The I and the am and the I am is all kind of emergent through this whole process of evolution and so on. That's just surface waves, and there's a much deeper ocean that we're trying to figure out here. So how does some of the stuff you're thinking about maps to space-time? How does it map to space-time?
Right. So just at very, very high level, and I'll keep it brief. The structures that the physicists are finding, like the amplitude heater, it turns out they're just static structure. They're polytopes. But remarkably, most of the information in them is contained in permutation matrices. So it's a matrix, like an n by n matrix, that just has zeros and ones. That contains almost all of the information. And they have these Plavic graphs and so forth that they use to boot up the scattering. You can compute the scattering amplitudes almost entirely from these permutation matrices. So that's just, now from my point of view, I have this conscious agent dynamics. It turns out that the stationary dynamics that I was talking about, where the entropy is increasing, all the stationary dynamics are sketched out by permutation matrices. So there's a so-called Birkhoff polytope. All the vertices of this polytope, all the points, are permutation matrices. All the internal points are Markovian kernels that have the uniform measure as a stationary measure.
I need to intuit a little better what the heck you're talking about, but so basically, there's some complicated thing going on with the network of conscious agents, and that's mappable to this.
That's right.
You're saying a two-dimensional matrix that scattering has to do with what? With our the perception, like that's like photon stuff. Or I mean, I don't know if it's useful to sort of dig into detail.
I'll do just the high level thing.
Yes.
So the high level is the long-term behavior of the conscious agent dynamics. So that's a projection. Just looking at the long-term behavior, I'm hoping will give rise to the amplituhedron. The amplituhedron then gives rise to space-time. And so then I can just use their link to go all the way from consciousness through its asymptotics through the amplituhedron into space-time and get the map all the way into our interface.
And that's why you mentioned the permutation matrix, because it gives you a nice thing to try to generate.
That's right. It's the connection with the amplituhedron. The permutation matrices are the core of the amplituhedron, and it turns out they're the core of the asymptotic description of the conscious agents.
So not to sort of bring up the idea of a creator, but I like, first of all, I like video games, and you mentioned this kind of simulation idea. First of all, do you think of it as an interesting idea, this thought experiment that we live in a simulation? And in general, do you think we'll live in a simulation?
So the Nick Bostrom's idea about the simulation is typically couched in a physicalist framework.
Yes.
So there's the bottom level. There's some programmer in a physical space-time, and they have a computer that they've programmed brilliantly, cleverly, where they've created conscious entities. So you have the hard problem of consciousness, right? The standard hard problem. How could a computer simulation create a consciousness? Which isn't explained by that simulation theory. But then the idea is that the next level, the entities that are created in the first level simulation then can write their own simulations, and you get this nesting. So the idea that this is a simulation is fine, but the idea that it starts with a physicalist base, I think, isn't.
Well, there's different properties here. The partial rendering, and to me, that's the interesting idea. Is not whether the entirety of the universe is simulated, but how efficiently can you create interfaces that are convincing to all other entities that can appreciate such interfaces. How little does it take? Because you said like partial rendering or like temporal, ephemeral rendering of stuff. Only render the tree falling in the forest when there's somebody there to see it. It's interesting to think, how can you do that super efficiently without having to render everything? And that to me is one perspective on the simulation, just like it is with video games.
Right.
Where a video game doesn't have to render every single thing. It's just the thing that the observer is looking at.
Right. There is actually, that's a very nice question. And there's whole groups of researchers that are actually studying in virtual reality what is the sort of minimal requirements on this system, how does it have to operate to give you an immersion experience, to give you the feeling that you have a body, to get you to take it real. And there's actually a lot of really good work on that right now. And it turns out it doesn't take that much. You do need to get the perception action loop tight, and you have to give them the perceptions that they're expecting if you want them to. But if you can lead them along, if you give them perceptions that are close to what they're expecting, you can then maybe move their reality around a bit.
Yeah, it's a tricky engineering problem, especially when you're trying to create a product that costs little, but it feels like an engineering problem, not a deeply scientific problem. Or meaning, obviously, it's a scientific problem, but as a scientific problem, it's not that difficult to trick us, descendants of apes.
But here's a case for just us in our own. This is a virtual reality that we're experiencing right now. So here's something you can try for yourself. If you just close your eyes and look at your experience in front of you, to be aware of your experience in front of you, what you experience is just like a modeled dark gray. But there's some dynamics to it, but it's just dark gray. But now I ask you, instead of having your attention forward, put your attention backward. What is it like behind you with your eyes closed? And there, it's like nothing. It's real. So what is going on here? What am I experiencing back there? It's right.
Well, it's I don't know if it's nothing. It's like, I guess it's the absence of. It's not even like darkness or something.
It's not even darkness. There's no qualia to
Yeah.
it, and yet there is a sense of being, and that's the interesting.
Yeah.
There's a sense of being back. So I close my. When I put my attention forward, I have the qualia of a gray model thing. But when I put my attention backward, there's no qualia at all. But there is a sense of being.
Yeah. I personally, now you haven't been to that side of the room. I have been to that side of the room. So for me, memories, I start playing the engine of memory replay, which is like I take myself back in time and think about that place where I was hanging out in that part. That's what I see when I'm behind. So that's an interesting quirk of humans too. We're collecting these experiences and we can replay them in interesting ways whenever we feel like it. And it's almost like being there, but not really, but almost.
That's right. And yet we can go our entire lives in this. You're talking about the minimal thing for VR. We can go our entire lives and not realize that all of my life, it's been like nothing behind me.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're not even aware that all of our lives, if you just pay attention, close your eyes, pay attention to what's behind me, we're like, oh, holy smoke. It's scary. I mean, it's like nothing. There's no quality there at all. How did I not notice that my entire life? We're so immersed in the simulation, we buy it so much.
Yeah. I mean, you could see this with children, right? Though with persistence, you could do the peekaboo game. You can hide from them and appear, and they're fully tricked. And in the same way, we're fully tricked. There's nothing behind us, and we assume there is. And that's really interesting. These theories are pretty heavy. You as a human being, as a mortal human being, how has these theories been to you personally? Like, are there good days and bad days when you wake up and look in the mirror and the fact that you can't see anything behind you? The fact that it's rendered, like, is there interesting quirks? Nietzsche with his, if you gaze long into the abyss gazes into you. How's these ideas change you as a person?
It's been very, very difficult. This stuff is not just abstract theory building because it's about us. Sometimes I've realized that there's this big division of me. My mind is doing all this science and coming to these conclusions, and the rest of me is not integrating it. It's like, I don't believe it. I just don't believe this. It seems. So as I start to take it seriously, I get scared myself. It's like, listen. But it's very much. Then I read these spiritual traditions and realize they're saying very, very similar things. It's like there's a lot of convergence. So for me, I have. The first time I thought it might be possible that we're not seeing the truth was in 1986. It was from some mathematics we were doing. And when that hit me, it hit me like a ton of bricks. I had to sit down. It was scary. It was really a shock to the system. And then to realize that everything that has been important to me, like, getting a house, getting a car, getting a reputation, and so, well, that car is just like the car I see in the virtual reality. It's there when you perceive it, and it's not there. So the whole question of, what am I doing and why? What's worthwhile doing in life? Clearly, getting a big house, getting a big car. I mean, we all knew that we were going to die. So we tend not to know that. We tend to hide it, especially when we're young. Before age 30, we don't believe we're going to die. But
we factually maybe know that you kind of are supposed to, yeah.
But they'll figure something out, and
Yeah.
we're the generation that's the first one that doesn't have to die.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing. But when you really face the fact that you're going to die, and then when I start to look at it from this point of view, that, well, this thing was an interface to begin with. So what I'm really going to be doing, just taking off a headset. So I've been playing in a virtual reality game all day, and I got lost in the game and I was fighting over a Porsche. and I shot some guys up, and I punctured their tires, and I got the Porsche. Now I take the headset off, and what was that for? Nothing. It was a data structure, and the data structure is gone. So all of the wars, the fighting, and the reputations, and all this stuff, where it's just a headset. So now, so my theory says that intellectually, my mind, my emotions rebel all over the place. It's like and so I have to meditate. I meditate a lot.
What percent of the day would you say you spend as a physicalist, sort of living life, pretending your car matters, your reputation matters? Like how much was that Tom Waits song, I Like My Town with a Little Drop of Poison? How much poison do you allow yourself to have?
I think my default mode is physicalist.
Right.
I think that's just the default. I when I'm not being conscious,
Yeah.
consciously attentive, then
Intellectually consciously attentive. Because if you're tasting coffee and not thinking, or drinking, or just taking in the sunset, you're not being intellectual, but you're still experiencing it.
Right.
So it's when you turn on the introspective machine, that's when you can start.
and turn off the thinker. When I actually just start looking without thinking.
Huh.
So that's when I feel like all of a sudden I'm starting to see through. Sort of like, okay, part of the addiction to the interface is all the stories I'm telling about it. It's really important for me to get that, really important to do that. So I'm telling all these stories, and so I'm all wrapped up. Well, almost all the mind stuff that's going on in my head is about attachment to the interface. And so what I found is that essentially the only way to really detach from the interface is to literally let go of thoughts altogether. And then all of a sudden, even my identity, my whole history, my name, my education, and all this stuff is almost irrelevant, because it's just now here is the present moment. And this is the reality right now. And all of that other stuff is an interface story. But this conscious experience right now, this is the only reality as far as I can tell. The rest of it's a story. But that is, again, not my default. That is, I have to make a really conscious choice to say, okay, I know intellectually this is all an interface. I'm going to take the headset off and so forth, and then immediately sink back into the game and just be out there playing the game and get lost in it. So I'm always lost in the game unless I literally consciously choose to stop thinking.
Isn't it terrifying to acknowledge that, to look beyond the game? Isn't it,
It scares the hell out of me. It really is scary. Because I'm so attached. I'm attached to this body. I'm attached to the interface.
Are you ever worried about breaking your brain a bit? Meaning, like, it's, I mean, some of these ideas, when you think about reality, even with, like, Einstein, just realizing, you said interface, just realizing that light, that there's a speed of light, and you can't go faster than the speed of light, and, like, what kind of things black holes and can do with light, even that can mess with your head.
Yes.
But that's still space-time.
That's a big mess, but it's still just space-time. It's still a property of our interface. That's right.
But it's still, like, even Einstein realized that this particular thing, some of the stories we tell ourselves, is constructing interfaces that are oversimplifying the way things work. Because it's nice. The stories are nice. Stories are nice. It's just like video games. They're nice.
Right, but Einstein was a realist, right? He was a famous realist in the sense that he was very explicit in a 1935 paper with Podolsky and Rosen, the EPR paper, where they said, if without in any way disturbing the system, I can predict with probability 1 the outcome of a measurement, then there exists in reality that element, right? That value, and we now know from quantum theory that's false. That Einstein's idea of local realism is strictly speaking false.
Yeah.
And so we can predict, we can set up in quantum theory. You can set up, and there's a paper by Chris Fuchs, Quantum Bayesianism, where he scouts this out. It was done by other people, but he gives a good presentation of this, where they have a sequence of something like 9 different quantum measurements that you can make, and you can predict with probability 1 what a particular outcome will be, but you can actually prove that it's impossible that the value existed before you made the measurement. So you know with probability 1 what you're going to get, but you also know with certainty that that value was not there until you made the measurement. So we know from quantum theory that the act of observation is an act of fact creation. And that is built into what I'm saying with this theory of consciousness. If consciousness is fundamental, space-time itself is an act of fact creation. It's an interface that we create, consciousness creates, plus all the objects in it. So local realism is not true. Quantum theory has established that. Also, non-contextual realism is not true. And that it fits in perfectly with this idea that consciousness is fundamental. These exist as data structures when we create them. As Chris Fuchs says, the act of observation is an act of fact creation. But I must say, on a personal level, I'm having to spend a couple hours a day just sitting in meditation on this and facing the rebellion in me that goes to the core. It feels like it goes to the core of my being, rebelling against these ideas. So here it's very, very interesting for me to look at this, because so here I'm a scientist and I'm a person. The science is really clear. Local realism is false. Non-contextual realism is false. Space-time is doomed. It's very, very clear. It couldn't be clearer. And my emotions rebel left and right when I sit there and say, okay, I am not something in space and time. Something inside of me says, you're crazy. Of course you are. And I'm completely attached to it. I'm completely attached to all this stuff. I'm attached to my body. I'm attached to the headset. I'm attached to my car. I'm attached to people. I'm attached to all of it. And yet I know as an absolute fact, I'm going to walk away from all of it. I'm going to die. In fact, I almost died last year. COVID almost killed me. I sent a goodbye text to my wife. So I thought I was.
You really did?
I sent her a goodbye. I was in the emergency room, and it had attacked my heart, and it had been at 190 beats per minute for 36 hours. I couldn't last much longer. I knew they couldn't stop it. So
that was it.
So that was it. So I texted her goodbye from the emergency room.
I love you, goodbye, kind of thing.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that was it. So
were you afraid?
Yeah, it scares the hell out of you, right? But there was, you're just feeling so bad anyway that all that sort of, you're scared, but you're just feeling so bad that in some sense you just want to stop anyway. So I've been there and faced it just a year ago.
How did that change you, by the way? Having this intellectual reality that's so challenging that you meditate on, it's just an interface, and one of the hardest things to come to terms with is that means that it's going to end. How did that change you, having come so close to the reality of it? It's not just an intellectual reality; it's a reality of death.
It's forced. I've meditated for 20 years now, and I would say averaging 3 or 4 hours a day. But it's put a new urgency. But urgency is not the right word, because it's riveted my attention. I'll put it that way. It's really riveted my attention, and I've really I spent a lot more time looking at what spiritual traditions say. By the way, again, not taking it with I take it all with a grain of salt. But on the other hand, I think it's stupid for me to ignore it. So I try to listen to the best ideas and to sort out nonsense from, and it's just, we all have to do it for ourselves, right? It's not easy. So what makes sense, and I have the advantage of some science, so I can look at what science says and try to compare with spiritual tradition. I try to sort it out for myself. But then I also look and realize that there's another aspect to me, which is this whole emotional aspect. I seem to be wired up, as evolutionary psychology says, I'm wired up, right? All these defensive mechanisms, I'm inclined to lie if I need to. I'm inclined to be angry, to protect myself, to have an in-group and an out-group, to try to make my reputation as big as possible, to try to demean the out-group. There's all these things that evolutionary psychology is spot on, is really brilliant about the human condition. And yet I think evolution, as I said, evolutionary theory, is a projection of a deeper theory where there may be no competition. So I'm in this very interesting position where I feel like, okay, according to my own theory, I'm consciousness. And maybe this is what it means for consciousness to wake up. It's not easy. It's almost like I feel like I have real skin in the game. It really is scary. I really was scared when I was about to die. It really was hard to say goodbye to my wife. It really pained. And to then look at that and then look at the fact that I'm going to walk away from this anyway and it's just an interface. So it's trying to put all this stuff together and really grok it, so to speak, not just intellectually, but grok it at an emotional level.
What are you afraid of, you silly evolved organism that's gotten way too attached to the interface? What are you really afraid of?
That's right.
Is there
It's very personal. It's very, very personal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, speaking of that text, what do you think is this whole love thing? What's the role of love in our human condition? This interface thing we have, is it somehow interconnected with consciousness? This attachment we have to other humans, and this deep, like there's some quality to it that seems very interesting, peculiar.
Well, there are two levels I would think about that. There's love in the sexual sense, and then there's love in a deeper sense. And in the sexual sense, we can give an evolutionary account of that and so forth. And I think that's pretty clear to people. In this deeper sense, right? So of course, I'm married. I love my wife in a sexual sense, but there is a deeper sense as well. When I was saying goodbye to her, there was a deeper, much deeper love that was really at play there. That's one place where I think that the mixed bag from spiritual traditions has something right. When they say, love your neighbor as yourself, that in some sense love is fundamental. I think that they're onto something very, very deep and profound. And every once in a while I can get a personal glimpse of that, especially when I'm in the space with no thought. Right? When I can really let go of thoughts, I get little glimpses of a love in the sense that I'm not separate. It's a love in the sense that I'm not different from that.
Yeah.
If you and I are separate, then I can fight you. But if you and I are the same, if there's a union there,
The togetherness of it.
Yeah.
Who's God? All those gods, the stories that have been told throughout history, you said through the spiritual traditions. What do you think that is? Is that us trying to find that common thing at the core? Oh,
well, in many traditions, not all. In the one I was raised in, so my dad was a Protestant minister, we tend to think of God as a being. But I think that that's not right. I think the closest way to think about God is being, period. Not a being, but being. The very ground of being itself is God. I think that's the deep, and from my point of view, that's the ground of consciousness. So the ground of conscious being is what we might call God. But the word God always been, for example, you don't believe the same God as my God, so I'm going to fight you, or we'll have wars over, because the specific being that you call God is different from the being that I call God, and so we fight. Whereas if it's not a being, but just being, and you and I share being, then you and I are not separate, and there's no reason to fight. We're both part of that one being, and loving you is loving myself, because we're all part of that one being. The spiritual traditions that point to that, I think, are pointing in a very interesting direction, and that does seem to match with the mathematics of the conscious agent stuff that I've been working on as well. That it really fits with that, although that wasn't my goal.
Is there? You mentioned that the young physicists that you talk to or whose work you follow have quite a lot of fun breaking with the traditions of the past, the assumptions of the past. What advice would you give to young people today, high school and college, not just physicists, but in general, how to have a career they can be proud of, how they can have a life they can be proud of, how to make their way in the world, from the lessons, from the wins and the losses in your own life? What little insights could you pull out?
I would say the universe is a lot more interesting than you might expect. And you are a lot more special and interesting than you might expect. You might think that you're just a little tiny, irrelevant 100-pound, 200-pound person in a vast billions of light years across space. And that's not the case. You are, in some sense, the being that's creating that space all the time, every time you look. So, waking up to who you really are outside of space and time, as the author of space and time, as the author of everything that you see.
Author of space and time. That's beautiful.
Sorry. You're the author of space and time, right? And I'm the author of space and time. And space and time is just one little data structure. Many other consciousnesses are creating other data structures. They're authors of various other things. So realizing, and then realizing that I had this feeling that growing up, going to college, reading all these textbooks, oh man, it's all been done. Yeah, if I'd just been there 50 years ago, I could have discovered this stuff, but it's all in the textbooks now. Well, believe me, the textbooks are going to look silly in 50 years. And it's your chance to write the new textbook. So of course, study the current textbooks. You have to understand them. There's no way to progress until you understand what's been done. But then the only limit is your imagination, frankly. That's the only limit.
The greatest books, the greatest textbooks ever written on Earth are yet to be written.
Exactly.
What do you think is the meaning of this whole thing? What's the meaning of life from your limited interface? Can you figure it all out? Like why? So you said the universe is kind of trying to figure itself out through us. Why?
Yeah, that's the closest I've come. So I'll give you. So I will say that I don't know, but I'll here's my guess. Right.
That's a good first sentence. That's a good starting point.
And maybe that's going to be a profound part of the final answer, is to start with the I don't know. It's quite possible that's really important, to start with the I don't know. My guess is that if consciousness is fundamental, and if Gödel's incompleteness theorem holds here, and there's infinite variety of structures for consciousness to, in some sense, explore, that maybe that's what it's about. This is something that Annika and I talked about a little bit, and she doesn't like this way of talking about it, and so I'm going to have to talk with her some more about this way of talking. But right now, I'll just put it this way, and I'll have to talk with her more and see if I can say it more clearly. But the way I'm talking about it now is that there's a sense in which there's being, and then there's the experiences or forms that come out of being. That's one deep, deep mystery. And the question that you asked, what's it all about? Somehow it's related to that. Why doesn't it just stay without any forms? Why does it Why do we have experiences? Why not just have, when you close your eyes and pay attention to what's behind you, there's nothing, but there's being. Why don't we just stop there? Why didn't we just stop there? Why did we create all tables and chairs and the sun and moon and people, all this really complicated stuff? Why? And all I can guess right now